So it looks like Orphan is a little bit orphan today, but it doesn't matter. I think people will regret not having participated in our panel.
4 o'clock here.
It's not 4 o'clock yet?
Yes, yeah,
It is 4 o'clock, right?
4:01.
4:01, there you go. So as you know, this panel is focused on orphan drug developments. Basically what we were told is that the audience was mainly looking for fundraising opportunities. Is that the case? Could we have an idea of who is looking for money?
Okay.
I think everyone else got money today.
So what they asked us to do is mainly to make this panel educational and advisory. So at first, I would like to start with a round of introductions. I am Annette Bakker. I'm the president and CSO of the Children's Tumor Foundation. Our foundation is focused on a rare genetic disorder called neurofibromatosis. And what we have been looking for over the last couple of years is really looking at that unique role of foundations. And our conclusion was that foundations have two things. First of all, they're super connected to the patients, to the clinicians, to the researchers, because we are really, we know everybody. And the other thing that we are is that we have a pretty deep knowledge of the disease. So build on those two let's say premises, we have been focused on doing two things. The first one is I call it team science on steroids, which is we broke through all the silos, so our teams are composed of both basic scientists, translational, and clinicians. They have to share their data in real time in a data hub, and the programs are driven by the foundation, managed by the foundation, and people only get paid when they share their data. The second thing we have been doing is really build a platform. It's kind of an infrastructure where we have tried to develop answers to all the typical pharma questions, like where are the patients, where are the cell lines. So really having created and completed infrastructure to de-risk NF for pharma and biotech. So with that, I would like to pass over to Andrew.
Yep, great. So hi everyone. My name is Andrew Hutchinson. I work in the external research and scouting team at Alexion Pharmaceuticals. So Alexion Pharmaceuticals is, I'm sure a number of you have heard of us. We're a specialty company focused on development of drugs for rare diseases. We have currently 3 marketed drugs. One called Solaris, which is a complement inhibitor, which is our big blockbuster drug. We also have a drug called Strensiq for hyperphosphatasia, which is, so Strenzic's an enzyme replacement therapy to treat HPP, which is a horrible bone disorder where infants are born with this disease where they can't actually mineralize their bone. So Strensiq is the ERT that helps replace the defective enzyme in those patients. And then we also have another drug called Kanuma, which is another enzyme replacement therapy where basically infants are born with a deficiency in lysosomal acid lipase, and Kanuma is an ERT replacement for that and restores their enzyme activity so they can metabolize cholesterol esters properly in the liver. Alexion, this is we're a big company. That's our niche. We in the past have really focused on that ultra rare disease space. Had some challenges, and we're really moving more into the rare disease area. So ultra rare diseases might be anywhere less than 10,000 treatable patients worldwide. We're still interested in that space, but we are broadening our filters a little bit to focus more in the rare disease space. And that's really. Awesome, Arthur.
Thank you. Arthur?
Yeah.
Art Pappas with Pappas Capital. We're a life science venture capital firm. We're based in North Carolina, but we invest across the United States. Our investments are in therapeutics. We have 3 arms to our business. We're largely known for our Pappas Ventures venture funds. Those funds have about $550 million under management. Names of companies you might know in that regard include Ultragenics, where we basically part of the team that backed that management team in going forward. Lumina, which we started from scratch. In both those companies, we work with foundations. We've worked with foundations in driving them forward. We also have a second arm of our business, which is our specialized fund management group, which are single LP relationships. Our largest is in the rare disease space. We have that with Chiesi Pharmaceuticals. Chiesi is a mid-sized Italian pharma company. We represent part of their interest in the United States through the venture arm. That's early stage, rare disease, and we'll do things across the board in that regard. We have a third arm of our business, which is our translational research arm. It also does extramural R&D for some of the pharma companies. There, everything we do is tied to a foundation. So, for example, the one that we drove, the kind of the largest translational program in biomedical engineering, was with the Coulter Foundation. This is Beckman Diagnostics that bought Coulter Diagnostics. We manage the program at Duke University in that regard. Coulter is also an investor in our fund, so that's how it ties the relationship. The last comment I'll make relates to our limited partner base. We have 10 pharmaceutical companies, 2 CROs, and 1 device company across all of our funds. These are unencumbered relationships. But what it does do, it gives us deal flow, and we'll start companies with some of these groups, as well as being able to show them our deal flow and get some support on the due diligence. Afferent is a company we did with Roche, who's an investor in our fund that we started. This is in the P2X3 pain area for chronic cough. We also did one with Lilly, Collucid, which we founded. Both these companies we founded ourselves.
Thank you. Chris?
Good afternoon. My name is Chris Adams, co-founder and CEO of Sidon. Sidon is an orphan drug accelerator. We started about 4 years ago with capital from NEA, Pfizer, Lundbeck, Bay City Capital, and Alexandria to identify translational assets in the orphan genetic disease space, and where we will invest our capital to de-risk and develop promising therapeutic options and take them to an inflection point, and that inflection point is then a Series A, which is being funded by the same investor syndicate that has given Sidon the capital. So we look for opportunities specifically targeting very specific mechanisms of disease that are built on genetics, no oncology, no infectious diseases. So some of you asked for meetings here today, and I declined them. If that was the case, I apologize, but it was probably because you were not into the genetic space. So how do we do this? Well, we actually have a team of 3 scientists, 2 business people, and we try and find these opportunities both in academia, through foundations, through our network, and we spend between $1.5 and $3 million on the de-risking part, and then we can raise anywhere between $30 and $50 million to do the Series A to take it to human proof of concept. We've looked at more than 800 opportunities, invested in 17, so you can look, we're pretty quick at saying no. We have to be, because time is our most important resource. Capital is not, believe it or not, because NEA is backing us. And what we try and do in those 17 is to very quickly get to the killer experiment. So what is it likely that will give us the conviction that something doesn't work? Because that is mostly what some people, I think, hang on too long to their idea. So we're very deliberate in our decision not to move forward, and we try and kill things for as little capital as we can, obviously, and do the most critical experiment that will then convince our investors to invest. So three companies were started, two which I'll tell you about. One is a test, which is an MCATS asset that we spun out from Big C, which was acquired, which we spent about $30 million on, out of a total raise of 42. And then that was acquired by Sucampo earlier this year for a very nice multiple. The second company was Imara, which we spun out of, or we licensed from Lundbeck, a small molecule PD-9 inhibitor that we're developing in sickle cell disease. And again, for less than $13 million, we've gotten that asset to phase 2. So the idea is with as little capital as you can, get to a value inflection point, and you can then hopefully sell the asset to a partner.
Thank you. Leonard?
Hi, my name is Leonid Saad. I'm the CEO of co-founder of Alkeus Pharmaceuticals. Alkeus is, so I'm not an investor, Alkeus is a small biotech company. So just like some of you here in the room, I can provide some of the perspective as an entrepreneur. I started Alkeus after working for 2 years in venture capital firm, and my specialty was in regenerative medicine. I started off with looking for assets which would be in mostly currently untreatable diseases, untreatable conditions. I think untreatable conditions are very interesting in the sense that at least you'll be probably one of the only ones running a clinical trial, so you do not need, no one has an idea what to expect from phase 2 efficacy clinical trials, but the worst that can happen is to go after an indication which is already crowded and have a drug that is subpar. So at least in rare conditions, there's a very high chance that you'll be able to find assets which are for currently untreatable conditions. So in 2010, I started Alkeus Pharmaceuticals, looked at 250 different assets for about a year. So I don't know if is that about the same speed? About the same rate. So it's and screened them down to narrowed it down to 100 assets, then 20, then 5. And eventually I had to make a decision on which asset, because I could only afford one back then, which asset I would buy. The asset that I purchased came out of Columbia University, so it was a license from Columbia, and it's to treat a rare form of blindness called Stargardt's disease, which leads to the loss of central vision during adolescence mostly, and there's no treatment available for Stargardt. The drug that we have could also potentially be used for age-related macular degeneration, and this is what we're starting at this point. So in the 7 years of our existence, we brought this drug from early preclinical development to now in the middle of a phase 2 clinical trial. For Stargardt, we've used a very lean model in terms of capital efficiency or human resource efficiency. We're featured in the news quite frequently because of that efficiency. We're Fierce 15 biotech winners in 2012. So really what I can talk about, and I'd be happy to answer questions, is how do you maintain a company that's extremely lean and yet bring it to middle of phase 2 trials? How do you find the best partners, which could be partners involves not only those who will do the operations, but also partners, financial partners, some of them could be on the table. So I'd be happy to answer those questions.
So in fact, to that point, that's exactly, in fact, a good segue into the asset sourcing. So we're looking here at two companies, Alexion, where you're looking at portfolio building, right? How many assets how do you select your assets to build a portfolio? And then Leonid, who says, I went down from 250 to 1. So could you two talk a little bit about the difference in approach when you need to build a portfolio versus when you really drill down to 1? What can you tell the audience about that? So maybe Andrew, you want to start about the portfolio building?
Yeah, well, so from Alexion's perspective, we're obviously a large company. If you look at our revenues, the majority of our income comes from one drug, so Solaris, and obviously we need to diversify. So we are looking for opportunities that are going to, at least give us another source of revenue that will kind of protect the company moving forward. So the challenge is for us is that we've mainly, in the past, we've mainly focused in that ultra-rare disease space, and we obviously are still very interested in that area, but when we have companies coming to us, we do our due diligence. One of the things that often fail is that reasons why things fall down is that a company will come to us and there'll be epidemiology data that's out there in the literature saying that there's 3,000 or 4,000 patients out there that we could potentially treat. When we actually go through and do our due diligence, we'll actually find that 9 out of 10 times that those estimates are actually well below what's actually published. There's definitely a lot of bias out there in the literature towards, I guess, overestimating the number of patients there are in rare diseases, and that's been hard for us because that's what we wanted to get into, and that's our bread and butter. But really, what we're looking for now is to move into those larger indications where we can help fill that gap and diversify our portfolio. So it is very challenging sourcing assets, and we do. I look at. mainly an early stage guy. I look at hundreds of assets as well, of opportunities, and I might only recommend one or two to actually recommend to our BD team to actually go forth and do a full-scale due diligence. And as I said, one of the big reasons is that there probably aren't enough patients out there that are going to at least fill the needs of our company in the immediate future.
Is there any other critical, Leonid, that you would, any critical other decision point where you say, this is kind of the reason why I selected that one and not the other 10 or 2 or 5? What is kind of your, what could you, what are some tips?
And you know, many times it's gut feeling. So eventually, when you're narrowed it down to your top 5, and you can only afford one, so we're not Alexion, so we can't afford several of them. Not to say that there's always that many good assets. I think the difference when you're a small company is truly the financing, and how are you going to fund those ones, those assets. Most of the time also they will have, if you're an entrepreneur, they will have to be preclinical assets. It's really hard to acquire a phase 1 asset or a phase 2 asset already at this price, at a low price. That's usually what pharmaceutical companies would try and do. But in my case, when I was at my top final 5 and I truly enjoyed working or trying to collaborate with those researchers, my final criteria was truly a finance one. It was, if I'm alone for 2 years with just my family's cash and my own cash, can I bring it to the next level? And it was just as simple as that. And only one asset, which is the one that we licensed, met that criteria. And it was exactly what happened. Which is we spent 23 months, so close to 2 years, with no investors, and it was very, very difficult. But then we closed our Series A in 23 months later. So that's when we had external investors and external validation. So truly, that's a criteria. So it's got nothing to do with, let's say, the science. I loved each of those projects, but it was really about staying lean and knowing the fact that we were in around 2008, 2010, when the financial markets were also very, very pessimistic for a few years.
So there's one criteria that I think for Sidon is probably the most important one, and that's what am I impacting on the disease? So what's the clinical benefit that particular modality will have? So not a marginal benefit, but something truly changes outcome. And Strensiq, which is the drug that Andrew talked about earlier, when you see the videos of babies that can only crawl or not even move, and then they run around, that's truly moving, and that's one of the reasons why that drug is a breakthrough drug with a very high price, which is, I think, part of the next topic. But so the clinical impact, look for something that really moves the needle, because you don't want to spend 5 years doing this for some incremental benefit. And by the way, nobody cares about that because they won't invest in that idea. They want something that will really change outcome for patients.
Yeah, and especially it's very relevant when you're in rare diseases, especially the ultra-rare diseases, because there's not many patients around, right? So you want to have a transformative therapy that makes a big difference to justify doing a small clinical trial as well. So an incremental improvement, you may not have enough patients to even power the trial in the first place.
Right. Thank you.
Do you have an example of drugs that would be FDA approved, which doesn't have a strong impact? Do you have a counter example?
Marathon Pharmaceuticals.
Yeah, that's a good one.
So there's lots of
anybody.
We have a question.
There's quite a few.
Susan at the back has a question.
Okay, Susan.
Yes, I'm interested to understand what's different about the clinical trial path in a rare disease when you have limited patients and clearly it's not $1 billion drug. So how does the clinical path differ?
That was exactly the question for Arthur. Thank you.
So
I have it here.
I don't know if the clinical path differs
like the
from
whole
what
path,
you
right?
want. To me, it's the quality of the clinical path, and therefore it's the quality of the preclinical data you're making your decisions off of. If we've walked away from a deal, it's because we're all trying to be capital efficient, but the way the preclinical work might be done just it's not complete, and therefore it doesn't fit the standards. In our case, we're trying to build products or companies to get acquired. We don't want pharma coming in, looking at it and say, gosh, I got to redo this preclinical work. Or your phase 1 and phase 2A, your N is just off by what, I mean, statistically you should know that going in, but the quality of that phase 1, phase 2A is so critical in our mind that it goes into the point about the differentiation of the impact this drug is going to have on a patient. So for us, it's not so much what you asked, it's more the quality of all that.
And maybe also the timeline that you can get to that outcome. How can you? We had a panel earlier today where is there a shortcut, right? And the answer to that is I don't think there's a shortcut necessarily, but if you understand the disease well enough that you're trying to track, and with diseases that have, I'm going to use the word natural history. Leonid and I were just talking about that earlier. Understanding what actually happens to a patient in the course of their disease progression, and being able to fit your clinical outcomes to that measure that thing. And what is that? Because in most diseases, you're the first party doing a study. So can you actually figure that out in a reasonable time frame? So it's not really difference in terms of the thinking. Of course, you need fewer patients if it's an impactful effect. But I think you have to adapt your process to the capital you have to do it, and also be smart about the way you spend your capital on which part of the process can you spend money on that is actually value creating, right? But you don't want to cut corners, because Art is right. When that data room is up and whoever comes into the data room looks at it, they will find what's not right. And then your deal's probably done.
Yeah. And that would also tie into your CMC component, where a lot of rare disease or a lot of opportunities fail because the work that has to be done with CMC is pretty substantial.
Yeah, there's another interesting component of all this in relation to clinical development, especially in that ultra-rare disease space. And this is from direct experience at Alexion, and I won't name the program, but we had a drug in development, and it was for a rare disease. Maybe we knew at the time there's probably 1,000 patients worldwide. There are other companies developing drugs for the same disease, and we ran into a situation where we actually didn't think we were going to be able to recruit enough patients to do a clinical trial because they were on other companies' clinical trials. So that's something also to bear in mind, is that if you're in that really rare space and you want patients and there is already competition there, just be mindful of how what your path forward is, especially if someone else is already developing something in clinic and taking those patients away from your trial. So something to bear in mind.
Maybe I want to add a comment also on the clinical development side, or endpoints, is the try to make a use of surrogate endpoints, so surrogate biomarkers as much as you can. So sometimes some diseases don't necessarily are not extremely symptomatic, or the symptoms appear only much later down the road. So it makes your trial extremely long and absolutely impossible to do. There's no really official leeway from the FDA that they will let you get away with only one phase 3, for example, or only one phase 2 officially. Now, we've had the example from Sarepta, for example, or others, that it's possible. But there's a process called accelerated approval. So it's a subpart H of the FDA through the NDA or the BLA pathway. And so those will help you, if you find a surrogate biomarker, to be able to use that surrogate biomarker to get an FDA approval. So an accelerated FDA approval under the reasonable likelihood that your biomarker could lead to clinical efficacy. So usually the FDA gives you a conditional approval with the pathway of various clinical trials you need to perform as confirmatory clinical trials, so that your drug continues to be approved or is withdrawn post-approval.
Great.
So on that point, what type of clinical efficacy do you have to demonstrate or are you talking about an indication where the biological response is sufficient to provide something useful for the FDA to look at? Do you understand my question?
Yes. So in the case of, for example, Sarepta, they used as a biomarker the amount of dystrophin proteins which was synthesized by the muscle. They took a muscle biopsy, measured the amount of protein, and they said, okay, based on that increase in the amount of dystrophin, working dystrophin in this muscle tissue, there's a reasonable likelihood that there will be clinical efficacy. Of course, that's debatable, but that's what they based their approval on. Many drugs have been based on subpart H. Let me think about other. Do you have another one right now?
The only one I have is the one where they didn't approve it. So,
Okay.
so that was Foldarex. So Foldarex was not approved under Subpart H, and we tried to make the argument that stabilization of the transthyretin tetramer was predictive of a change in clinical benefit. We was one of the arguments we had. But I think more importantly is look at the patient journey. Talk to patients. Talk to, I think in your disease, I think that's really true. Is what really impacts a patient or what impacts a family, and is there something in your therapy that not only gives you a good argument of why the therapy could work mechanistically or genetically, but will it have an impact on some aspect of the disease that is actually relevant for that population? And the earlier you can go and talk to key opinion leaders, I think, there was somebody who said earlier in the day, surround yourself with your experts, right? Because those critical experts, and I know that they cost money, but it's actually worth it, because if you get to somebody that is an expert in a particular area, CMC, tox, and those aspects of disease, build a team, a cadre of people around you that is actually really helpful. Because when somebody does diligence from a venture investor or from other investors on your asset, they will look at who's associated with that asset. It's one of the first things I look at. Where did it come from? What's the provenance of this? So over 4 years, I can tell you, there are things coming back now after 4 years. They're repackaged with a new name, with a new, the same BS, but repackaged. So be careful about what you pick up and learn the history.
But,
And also,
I was going to follow up.
Okay.
So we have an orphan in cancer
Right.
with a target that has linked to it a family of biomarkers. So would you envision, now maybe you don't get that type of review with the biomarkers alone, but could you envision that if I had clinical efficacy with the target and those biomarkers all being reduced, and then I went to a basket trial and I looked at those markers, could I then potentially get initial approval from the FDA for use in those other solid tumors?
I don't know if I won't even try to answer that. But what I will say, under PDUFA 5 and certainly under PDUFA 6, I think you'll find a receptive audience with the FDA to answer that question. And I think doing what Chris just said with the foundations, with the different constituents that might come forward, you'll get a receptive ear, because they're more cooperative than I've ever seen them around these unmet medical needs and the novel medicine that you're developing. And if they see the benefit that you can show them, then you'll get that kind of answer.
I can't comment on cancer.
All I need is the check.
But the cancer, I can't comment on cancer because it's such, you mentioned multiple factors, multiple markers.
The markers are all tied
to one thing, yeah. But I think you have to go individually, and as a small company, you can get scientific advice. So, if you have an orphan designation, maybe for your therapy, you can get, and in fact, in Europe, go to Europe, because in Europe, an individual country will get you a response back too. So you don't just have to go to the EMA for your scientific advice.
And to the point of impact, so one of the things that we've experienced at the foundation is that when we launched the consortium for one of the 3 forms of NF, which is schwannomatosis, the researchers were focused on figuring out a treatment that would shrink the tumors. And the patients said, we don't care, we want to get rid of the pain. And that has led to a whole different thing. So I would definitely encourage you, like Chris said, listen to the patients. What is impactful for them? Is exactly shrinking the tumor something you want to do, or is that they don't care, they just want to get rid of something else, improve their quality of life or whatever it is. So I think the patients' foundations start to play a more important role here, because they could be that voice that makes sure that you focus on the right things. But to the point, so one of the things that kept coming back, in fact, during our discussion tonight was about impact. But what you brought up shortly, Chris, was pricing. So we've heard all these extraordinary prices for orphan drugs that sometimes then the patients cannot afford anymore. So I really would like to kind of open a discussion with the panel in the room about our view on pricing and what is justifiable, looking, kind of the balance between impact and pricing.
Okay, so as some of you in this room know, I go back 20 years to a company called TKT. We launched one of the first orphans in Europe under the Orphan Drug Act called Replagal for Fabry disease. And it's interesting how you come up with a price, because you know what you've invested, you know what you've spent on your capital you've spent on the drug, and you know what are other things in the area of, let's say, enzyme replacement therapy at the time. You know what other prices have been charged. But I think we're coming into this was 20 years ago almost, right? So we're coming into an era though where it's no longer enough just to say, oh well, because these other therapies are priced at this level, I should get the same sort of price. Right? I think we're done with that. I think you have to have a global value dossier. So what I mean by that is a description of what it is that you're impacting for that patient. And it's hard to collect that as a small company. As a larger company, you can collect that data during phase 3. As a small company, you've got to actually create a story around not just the value of the therapy itself, but also all the things that you're providing to that patient in the course of that managing their disease. And that includes things like setting up home delivery for the drug, setting up reimbursement services for the patients, setting up the actual lobbying. And I can tell you, I was just with 3 of these people on this panel at Global Genes in LA, and it's amazing to see some of these mothers who are half the time they're spending lobbying the pharma company or the insurer to pay for their child's therapy. Right? It's not just you get it approved and then it's being reimbursed. It's a constant battle for every patient to get it reimbursed, and that's the U.S. where we have many insurers and many systems to get a drug on a formulary. Now we go to a single payer system, and there are countries that will just not pay what you think your drug is worth. And guess what will happen is those countries, and I think Alexion has shown that, you don't launch in those countries, so those patients don't get the therapy. Now you could argue that under the European rules, you can actually get the therapy. You just go to the other country where the therapy is being reimbursed and paid for, and some parents actually move their families to a country where that drug is approved and available, and it causes all sorts of issues, which we can't go into today. But I think that don't underestimate what it takes, not just to get the drug approved, but ultimately to get it put on a formula and reimbursed. So whatever models you build that say US launch is X, and then about a year later, maybe 8 months later, you get European approval, and many people have shown me their business plans have come back and said, oh yeah, and a month after that, I'm launching in 27 countries, right? Well, guess what? It's about 2.5 years, between 6 months and 2.5 years. Maybe Germany and the UK are the exceptions, where you can launch, you get approval, and a month or 2 later, you will get that rare disease paid for, the therapy paid for. So you have to be very careful about what you propose in your pitches to investors or to partners, what the value of your therapy is. Figure out what it is you're impacting. And I think, Mark, you've probably seen many of these business plans that have very unrealistic expectations of sales ramps post-launch of an orphan drug.
Yeah, in fact, just on the sales ramps or just the outcomes that Chris is referring to, something's going to happen with pricing, and we're all in this early stage investment cycle of these kinds of drugs. And we're talking 10 years from now, there will be a real shift in the way pricing is going to be looked at here. So therefore, the models you are building mean a lot to a venture folks going in. A lot of it has to do with the impact, not just on the patient, but on the whole system that the patient's involved in. What's the impact on caregivers? What's the impact on hospitals? All those pieces, which we don't know how they ultimately fit in, should be part of the analysis. We're really not interested in what that price is, which we're interested in what you're assuming the price will be and what you're benchmarking, but that's going to change just with the history of where the investment's going to go.
I think just another point, another aspect of all this, especially in genetic diseases where there might be a spectrum of deficiency, right? So if you get an enzyme deficiency, there might be 10% of patients that have complete null activity, but 90% of patients may have like 5% activity who have a much milder phenotype. what we often see is when companies come pitch to us is that they'll have, some genetic deficiency. They might have an enzyme replacement therapy or a substrate reduction therapy that they're pitching to us, and they'll say, oh, there's this many patients and the market size is this big. Often that's another area where things get muddled, that there's an overestimation of actually, realistically, you may only be treating that 10% group of patients that have the null deficiency. The patients with the milder phenotype, they may be fine on another type of therapy, or it may not justify the cost to, for that drug and the benefit of having it. So so just think about that as well when you're valuing your companies and your market.
We didn't mean to be sidestepping here, but sometimes with your ultra rare diseases, your trial could be the entire market.
Yep.
Right?
Exactly.
So then what?
Exactly. Yep.
So that's the challenge.
Yep.
But wait, guys, do you think the price are going to go down, or are they going to stay the same? It's just, but it's going to be harder to get reimbursed for.
Yeah.
What's going to happen? Because
If it goes down, then we have no investors will fund it, right? Because if you don't get that upside, there won't be an investment group. So if patients, of course, that come to us and say, why are you charging so much money? Well, if we can't charge so much money, then nobody would back a model where there's only a few thousand patients in a disease. So
what's the limit for pricing?
Well, that's hard to
That's
tell,
really
because
hard to say,
The
right?
model is going to change. I think it's going to change over the next 10 years. There will be substantial premium pricing allowed and supported by the insurance companies. What that range is,
I mean, with gene therapy as well.
gene therapy,
Who knows? But I think gene therapy is a one and done, right? So it's a different model, and I think there the incidence becomes your model.
Yeah.
So if your incidence becomes your model, you have to. Otherwise, it makes no sense, right? It makes no sense from an investment perspective.
we're
But I think-
taking that risk on the investment side.
You are,
Because we don't know that answer yet.
Yeah.
Right.
We're speculating that that's going to play out. We're also building in how the pharma companies are thinking about it, but also how the foundations and their constituents are thinking about it. Because like Chris said earlier, that demand and that support within the FDA is going to be critical.
And now look at CAR T with Novartis and a price, which is almost a guaranteed price, which is fine if you know that 90% of your patients are going to meet that criteria, but you don't know that with a rare disease. So you don't know that it's going to work for 90% of the cases. And then the definition of, I think they use the word success, which is really hard. What's success?
That's why pharma has to be in it, because
Yeah,
if they provide a guarantee on the outcome, well, the insurance company should be pleased to pay the appropriate price, whatever appropriate means, if it's going to save them X number of dollars. U.S. is different because we're fragmented in our insurer base, but it'll normalize.
I think what insurers are scared is that, and people have talked about 70s and U3. You guys have heard of this? So in the past, all the orphan drugs were priced at around $300,000 for the Kalydeco style drugs. Now it's $700,000. It's not $300,000 anymore. Spinraza, for example, that just came out and making a lot of sales. So it's
in year one.
In year one, yes.
Right.
Maybe
And then it gets
500,000,
less. It gets a bit
500,000
less
the second
afterwards,
year.
yeah.
But literally the prices, even if we talk about a lot about price pressure, prices have gone up recently.
But if the at least we've seen that if the the insurance providers know something's coming forward and they've budgeted for it accordingly, and they've been able to understand the savings that will affect the plan in total, then they're more receptive versus a surprise. I mean,
So value.
yeah, so exactly.
So,
But we're seeing more applications being looked at to help the payers kind of predict what is going to come forward out of a phase 2 pipeline that will treat a rare disease and what the cost might be for them. So they're thinking strategically how to build that into their operating plan.
So wait, so when you go in and when you're in phase 2, you already go and talk to the payers and tell them this is the price we're going to
No.
give?
No. You go and find out where's the impact, where you just so that there
What do they want to see?
what do they want to
terms of
see in
impact?
terms of impact that could be shown by your study.
Yeah, and that's the US, right? But, in the world where there's a single payer system, it is getting very, very hard to convince them to charge these very high prices.
I would still ask, what would you like to see in my phase 2B trial? particularly if it could end up being a registration
Yeah,
trial,
yeah.
that would convince you that the impact
It's
is
sufficient,
sufficient for reimbursement. We've never had, in the last 10 years, we're having those dialogues with payers, but prior to that, we never had those dialogues.
There's another question.
Yeah, go back to the launch question in Europe with all the many.
Can you speak up a little bit, because I
Go
think
back
it,
to the launch question you talked about with the 27 different countries. Do you ever see companies forgoing launches just because it's, like you might do 12 because those 12 are best reimbursement and best patient base?
So if you have an orphan drug, you have to get it approved through the centralized procedure, and then you get approval in all countries that are under the centralized procedure. Then you have to go back and negotiate price with each one of the payers, right? Except for 2 countries where you have initial pricing freedom, but then a year later they will review it. So Germany has a system called IQWIC. It's some acronym that I can't remember. Then in the in the UK it's NICE, right? So they get reviewed. So your price gets reviewed. And in the UK, I think you even have more health systems, so the individual health authorities in a given county or place can actually determine whether you're on reimbursed or not.
Once you have the universal thing, you still have to do the launches and all the
But the price is what matters. So if you don't get the price that you want, and you have to be careful because you can't really price it very differently across one country to another, because then you have parallel imports. Now that doesn't apply to biologics so much, but to other drugs it can apply to, where you just buy the drug in the country next to you, which happened often if there's a big price differential.
You can make the decision to launch outside of the payer system. I mean, you can. It's a more narrow market. You can build a franchise of users and then apply for reimbursement once you've got some outcomes. It's a much more costly
But probably
scenario.
probably not if your drug's $100,000.
That's well,
I think people try and do that in the device world.
yeah, but you also do it in the non-impact. I mean,
Yeah.
personalized medicine, not personalized medicine, but like cosmetic type stuff. You can pay $100,000 for something and not get reimbursement, right?
so shifting gears a little bit, challenges. So 2 things, challenges and future. Could you comment on that? What are the things people should look after? What are the things that you would advise?
Well, one of the interesting challenges is the Pfizer move of spinning out their rare disease is something, I think, speaking as an investor, we need to get our arms around, because there's always been a challenge with, particularly if you're building companies to be sold to the pharma, right? There's always been a question about how pharma is going to manage all these small manufacturing campaigns, how they're going to, from a cost basis, how they're going to manage all this intellectual property that has to be filed in a variety of different ways. And I found this move by Pfizer to be very interesting, as I found Glaxo's move to shut down rare disease is pretty interesting after they put in, what all investment they made. So that's going to be an unknown that to me presents a challenge to figure out, at least from an investor's perspective.
So the number of acquirers is going down.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that I'm worried about that. If you have a good asset and it fits in with the strategy, and you're right, I don't think anyone's calling on GSK anymore to sell a rare disease asset, but I think there is enough players out there that are in the rare disease space. So I think the Pfizer assets, are you referring to the one this week?
Just, yeah.
Springworth.
So there's only 4 assets. I think 2 of them are genetic diseases, and I think...
Well, one of them is neurofibromatosis, because they work with us.
I don't think that means that Pfizer isn't interested. I know it's not, doesn't mean that, because Pfizer is one of our investors. I'm familiar with the assets that were being spun out, and it took 2 years to spin them out. And so, it's an interesting approach to take assets that were not being prosecuted
It's a shelf
and get them out.
Exactly.
Right? But that doesn't mean Pfizer's out of the rare disease space, in my opinion. But back to your point, I think it is important to recognize that there's maybe 20, 30 companies out there that have a strategic interest in rare diseases, but it's not as many as it may used to be. At least, and it's much harder, I think, now to come up with assets. I believe the companies or assets are bought and not sold. So you have to be right at the right time with the right asset to find somebody that will buy it. It's not, you can't plan on the exit being the exit of a sale. You have to have optionality in your plan to either take it all the way to the next value inflection point, which means more investment from the investors, or actually even in rare diseases, you have people that have done it themselves and taken it all the way to commercialization. That's very hard to do outside the US, but it can be done if you have the right asset.
So just to Arthur's point, the company was announced yesterday. It's a spin out of Pfizer. It's called SpringWorks. And basically what they do is they take the shelved assets that Pfizer Inc. was not developing, but that really had a value, and one of them is the MEK inhibitor in neurofibromatosis. So we work with SpringWorks to do a phase 3 of that MEK inhibitor, so that in fact the clinical trial was not stopped. That's in fact the idea of kind of reusing those assets that Pfizer Inc. didn't pursue. So the last, I would like to have one sentence from every panel member as kind of general advice in the orphan drug space.
I'll start then.
Go on, you start.
Yeah, so I think, when we talked about
One
challenge-
sentence.
Yeah, challenge.
One sentence.
One sentence is, I think I see lots of opportunities into creating lots of new startups and new companies, which could eventually become, it's a long sentence, eventually become commercial because of the lean aspect of the fact that you can really design lean companies for orphan diseases. And so think of that whenever you start a company, that you can maintain it lean and bring it till the end.
Okay, that was a long one sentence. Come on, Chris, short one sentence.
Short sentence is learn the natural history of the disease you're targeting.
Mine is more of an optimistic statement. I think we're in just an unbelievable period with some unbelievable science coming together to create just novel medicines.
Mine's take time to understand the epidemiology.
Any further remarks from the room? The discussion was kind of open during the panel, so is there any further remarks, questions, observations? So did we end perfectly in time? So have a wonderful evening, everybody.